We're going to move on to the next session, which is Policy Planning and Economics, Making ISRU Work. And our first speaker is Luka Malone from Imperial College London, and he's going to talk about evaluating ISRU for a sustained lunar economy. Please welcome Luka to the stage.
Hi, so good morning, thank you. My name is Luka Malone. I'm a PhD student at Imperial College London. And today I'll be speaking this morning on a case study regarding how lunar ISRU can be evaluated for a sustained lunar economy. So this case study is the product of work done by an increasingly large research group consisting of researchers from Imperial College London, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the European Space Resources Innovation Center. So to give a brief preamble, Catherine Hadler said something very interesting yesterday. She said that both uncertainty is extremely present in ISRU, but that as more demonstration and pilot missions take place, this uncertainty will ultimately decrease. The problem with this is that if you are a private stakeholder who wants to contribute to and generate value in an ISRU economy, this uncertainty makes it extremely difficult to both commit to an initial capital investment today for the non-recurring engineering costs or the design, development, test, and evaluation costs associated with ISRU, which might not begin generating revenue realistically for at least a decade. So what we have done to address this is use real options analysis and stochastic modeling to estimate a guidance threshold for the non-recurring engineering costs for a lunar propellant-based venture that takes into account some of this uncertainty. So the question now becomes, how can we construct a case study that will allow us to basically study this? There are a couple of challenges to this. So in 2021, the Mars Oxygen ISRU experiment, or MOXIE, on board the NASA Perseverance rover, demonstrated that producing oxygen on other planetary bodies is possible, a technological milestone for ISRU development. The problem was that there was no one around to actually utilize this amazing resource. There were no stakeholders in situ that were able to purchase and use this commodity as a mission consumable. So we found that this is a common problem in ISRU economic evaluations, that in order to be able to close the supply-demand loop, we have to assume that at some point in the near future, we will be operating past the pilot stage at the full-scale industrial stage. And in a regime that NASA calls the sustained lunar evolution, where reliable resource transactions can take place between different stakeholders on the lunar surface. This creates another issue, as if we are now developing ISRU systems for this regime, the uncertainty around the lunar market compounds, and we now have to extrapolate even further into the future. Our solution is to consider the core uncertainty of propellant demand early in the design process and use flexible real options to design ISRU architectures that can respond to a wider range of emergent propellant demand scenarios. This ultimately allows us to build discounted cash flow models that estimate an appropriate budget for what a commercially motivated stakeholder should allocate to ISRU development up to this initial deployment date. Ultimately, the fundamental choice that we are trying to study and address is whether we deploy a very large-scale ISRU plant initially, or do we deploy a small modular ISRU plant in stages over time to meet growing anticipated demand. So our research methodology to explore this question was as follows. We first developed baseline deterministic ISRU plant designs in line with our core assumptions. We then subjected those baseline designs to uncertainty using a combination of both Monte Carlo simulations and geometric Brownian motion models to calculate expected net present values. We then introduced design flexibility in the form of the decision rule that will allow stakeholders to better adapt to an emerging demand environment. Finally, we ran a sensitivity analysis to determine how variations in our core assumptions affect the net present value changes associated with introducing this flexibility. So we have tried to align our case study with the goals and capabilities of real stakeholders to try to paint a picture of ISRU over the 2035 to 2045 regime that others can use as well. So we anticipate that in this regime, propellant demand will be largely driven by small orbital hoppers operating to and from the lunar surface, generating a propellant demand on the scale between 10 tons in 2035 to around 40 tons in 2045. If you got to hear Jun Shimada's talk from JAXA yesterday, this is roughly the same order of magnitude for a full-scale ISRU plant in terms of LOX production. For our baseline designs, we sized 4 different ISRU plants, each utilizing a solar-powered carbothermal reduction process, and each following the same basic concept of operations, just at different initial propellant production scales. Each design represented a trade-off between the economies of scale and landed mass that we see in ISRU and modularity. When we look at this deterministic baseline, we see that the best option is to deploy a medium-sized ISRU plant in 2 stages over the course of 10 years. You might think that this is not sensible in a deterministic analysis, and that a large-scale initial plant would be the best option, as it has the best economies of scale in terms of landed mass. But with a discounted cash flow approach, we are almost perversely rewarded for delaying capital expenditure, and it can make sense to deploy smaller, less effective plants over time from a net present value standpoint. This mechanic also helps capture the opportunity cost of ISRU. For example, if we were deploying a very large ISRU plant early on in 2035, we are losing the capability of potentially deploying something else that could be producing even more value over time. So after this deterministic baseline analysis, we then introduced uncertainty in our model in the form of a geometric Brownian motion model for propellant demand under assumptions from the literature and our stakeholders, and evaluated the net present values using Monte Carlo simulations. So we reevaluated the performance of our base case designs, but now under the uncertainty of a stochastic propellant demand. The same medium-sized plant has the highest mean net present value, but the answer is a lot more nuanced now, as the results are now a distribution as opposed to a point value. This is interesting, as the optimum answer now depends on the risk appetite of the stakeholders making the decision. A risk-seeking stakeholder, for example, might seek to maximize the values it gain, shown in the right column of this table here, instead of simply maximizing the mean result. So what we then did, we introduced a flexible real option into our model, which allows stakeholders to reconfigure the design in the face of uncertainty. We used the decision rule to model this, that determines when, if ever, propellant production capacities should be expanded in the form of repeating the initial ISRU plant deployment. In this case, we say that if liquid oxygen demand in a given year is greater than our current LOX production capacities, we repeat the initial deployment. Else we don't do anything. The use of the decision rule here is quite nice for a couple of reasons. It's very simple and easy for decision makers to understand and trust, unlike, for example, a machine learning model, and it allows stakeholders to easily tinker with this to better suit their needs. So we found that when we use this decision rule in a stochastic environment, we increase the expected net present value of our modular plants by a fairly large margin, around 20%, which is on par with this kind of flexible, introducing this kind of flexibility in complex engineering systems. This creates a value for this flexible option. This value of flexibility is measured as the difference between the net present value of the best performing modular and the best performing fixed plant design. Ultimately, the same medium-sized plant is seen to perform best in terms of our expected net present value and value at gain, but other designs exhibit better values at risk. So the last thing we did was we conducted a sensitivity analysis on this value of flexibility, looking at demand volatility, discount rate, launch costs, and the economies of scale that we used in our modeling. I'll go over the results of this briefly. Essentially, we found that the value of flexibility increased with lower discount rates, higher demand volatility, higher launch costs, and lower economies of scale in ISRU. The key takeaway here is how flexible design engineering at the system level can help mitigate threats stemming from uncertainty, which is seen as vital in a context such as ISRU, where there are many different uncertainties and both long development times and anticipated system life cycles only further compound this. We concluded that for a commercially driven ISRU stakeholder, hoping to break even for meeting anticipated lunar propellant demand from 2035 to 2045, it is sensible to invest approximately $150 million in non-recurring ISRU development costs, otherwise known as the design, develop, test, and evaluation cost of the ISRU system. For reference, the non-recurring engineering cost of the Falcon 9 rocket was estimated at around $390 million. We believe this value offers a good threshold with certain caveats for informing ISRU development specifically to meet this initial demand regime. We're working on a draft paper concerning this work that we hope will be made available to you soon. Thank you very much. I think.
Thank you very much, Luka. Have we any questions for Luka? Oh, we have Jerry.
That's Jerry. Hi,
I could
Jerry.
almost say, we always have Jerry.
So your market analysis, so your cost assumptions and analysis are based on creating a market assumption and then building from that market assumption. It seemed that you said that delaying investment in increasing production was better from a cash perspective, but I was wondering if you thought about the overproduction and storage aspect associated with making X amount more and therefore promoting possibly an increase in the market.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and it is something we actually looked at early in the analysis. So one of the ideas we had was to basically see if it made sense to deploy a small-scale ISRU plant very early, but with an increased locked storage capacity to be able to meet, and so with a smaller plant to be able to meet ISRU demand later on. We essentially found that it was difficult to estimate research and development costs at different timescales. So we decided to ultimately stick with an analysis where all of our options had the same timelines, essentially, in terms of research and development. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Exactly.
Sorry.
But that's okay. We can talk about it.
Well handled. Any other questions? Yes. If you can keep your hand up before, that makes it quicker.
Thank you, and I will keep this in mind for the next question. I was just wondering, so you spoke about introducing uncertainty in the model. How do you introduce uncertainty in terms of environmental impacts on the moon, and how it could impact the mission, for example?
Sorry, could you give me an example of what you mean by an environmental uncertainty?
Well, if the environmental conditions impact the mission, or if the mission impacts the environment to the point that the mission becomes difficult, this is like something, I don't have a specific example in mind, but...
Yeah. So we didn't address the latter, but we did look at how varying compositions of the regolith would affect our carbothermal reduction processes. And I'd try to essentially include that stochastic modeling for regolith composition into our, basically our just kind of cash flow model. We found that with current data that it had that particular uncertainty had a negligible effect on our discounted cash flow model. But I'm sure there's other uncertainties as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Clive. The dastardly duo that you both are.
Oh, I figured you'd notice me if I sat next to Jerry. So
I always notice you, Clive.
Coming back to the environment, understanding the lunar environment is something that we take for granted, but sometimes we don't. So I think just harping on how the lunar environment is going to impact your processing. For example, if you do molten regolith electrolysis on the moon, it may not work because you're in 16G and you're not going to get your bubbles out. So it's great down here because you're in 1G. But going up there, or the idea of thermal swings affecting your pilot plant, and that's why pilot plants, we were just talking, are designed to do that. How do you factor in that pilot plant into this model that, I don't care if it's stochastic or whatever uncertainty you put in there. If you don't understand the environment, there's a big uncertainty. And how do you account for that environment in the thermal swings, in the breakdowns? You get taken out by a meteoroid. There's that potential as well. How does your model deal with that?
Well, in terms of the what you said about pilot plants, so although we did model a carbothermal reduction process with solar power, and this was a bit arbitrary, but we did assume that at this point in 2035, or when the kind of lunar market essentially opens, that there will be pilot missions and demonstrators, and they ultimately will prove, hopefully, at least some technology, and that at that point we should have some reliability in the technologies that we are deploying in a full-scale plant. So the idea here is that we're not deploying a full-scale plant initially. There will be pilot missions, but we're just capturing in this. So essentially, in short, the pilot missions and the demonstrators we're seen as outside the scope of this.
Seems that they should be essential, in my opinion.
I'm going to save you. We're running out of time, but I think you're from Imperial and you may be answering one of these questions.
Yeah, so Luka is the brave soul who presented on behalf of our research group. So I'm leading this effort, and so to address your question, I think we need to take the broader context of our research. And we actually just published a study that looks very much into the question that you're asking. So we're not just interested in, what happens to the economics when the system is deployed, how it works, and so on. And our methodology is general enough to be able to handle any kind of technology. So if you want to assume MRE or carbothermal or whatever, right? We're agnostic in that sense. But the study now that we would just publish actually looks into that question, right? So in general, we're interested, how do you deploy these technologies in an extreme uncertain environment like space? There's different things that you can do, and that one looks at deploying a pilot plant to gather a bit more information as to how the technology works so that you can then make a decision. Is it better carbothermal reaction? Is that better ice water extraction? So we also have methods to deal with this type of uncertainty. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Luka.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to reiterate a notice that I said when there were not so many of you in the room at 11 o'clock sharp, which is that somebody called Anton Nikolotov has lost his credit card. So if you are he or him or know him, the credit card is at reception, and also there's a lost phone, which is at reception. So two things lost, both at reception. Also, if I could ask the speakers to be quick, because we have a very active audience who have lots of questions. So please welcome our next speaker to the stage, James Johnson from Colorado School of Mines. Sorry.
Very much, Lisa. Good morning. I'll start out. I know a handful of you may know me in professional capacity. I'm not here in a professional capacity with an unnamed space agency today. I'm here just on behalf of my own research with the Colorado School of Mines as a doctoral candidate. We'll be presenting a little bit about much lower scale demand and how habitation demand could go ahead and feed a lunar proving ground. So let's go ahead and begin with kind of an envisioned future, if you will. We see graphics like this that kind of are inspiring a symbiotic relationship of ISRU feeding habitation, rovers, and lander systems, but all has to start somewhere, and it has to scale progressively over time. So essentially, it needs to begin with a proving ground, right, in that local environment where there could be local, smaller scale demand for you to go ahead and learn from, where you can go ahead and exercise low rate production, to go ahead and understand how you can scale over time. And you may have a supportive ecosystem, so you aren't going alone. So what we'll be looking at is, could lunar habitation factor into that proving ground? And beginning that with a very simplified Excel-based model. You're not expected to go ahead and read this. Maybe I'll give you an eye test later. But what I'll summarize is the process in this model here. We start with understanding consumable rates and how those rates pair up with mission architecture and habitat design. There's 3 core documents that really feed developing that: NASA's Human Integrated Design Handbook, NASA's Baseline Values and Assumptions document, and there's also a paper by Chase Lynch et al. On logistics rates and assumptions for human exploration beyond low Earth orbit. Those 3 documents, several hundred pages worth, were fed into a steady state Excel model that allows us to calculate raw demand based on the basic parameters of mission architecture and habitat design, and then further allows us to calculate an equivalent system mass. This is a factor that's used typically in life support trade analyses, where you consider not just the mass of the consumable itself, but also the tertiary impacts of supporting power, thermal systems, even crew time, to understand the total equivalent mass value there to support all that infrastructure. The model also helps us do a first rough order estimate on cost. Now, this is with a fairly dated and fairly simplistic cost model. This is the advanced missions cost model, but it allows us to do kind of that quick look assessment in comparison with mass to understand break-even points. When does one architecture become more preferable, if you will, than another? So for habitation, that could be, am I resupplying my consumables from Earth? Am I regenerating and recycling them? Or am I leaning into an ISRU architecture? So now let's talk about, what does early habitation look like? Well, here are 2 concepts that are in development right now. There's the multi-purpose habitat, or MPH, and the pressurized rover, or PR. These 2 concepts are being fielded by the Italian Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency in collaboration or partnership with NASA as part of the Artemis campaign. These elements support 2 crew each, 1 mission per year, up to 28-day durations, debuting in the early 2030s. And while their designs are different, there is one common theme here, and that's that last sub-bullet. They are open-loop life support systems. That's what's being currently baseline. That means that they are in demand of oxygen and water to go ahead and sustain the crews inside for those initial missions. So again, demand is a factor of crew size, mission architecture, and habitat design. And as we feed those parameters into this Excel model, we're seeing much lower scale than what we've been talking about earlier. And I know you don't immediately see dollar signs when you see this kind of scale, but for a 28-day mission for 4 crew, we're seeing about 464 kilograms of water and about 225 kilograms of oxygen based on the major drivers shown on the left there. And again, that's for a 4 crew mission, 28 days with the 2 early habitation elements I mentioned earlier. Now, again, it's not just the raw demand mass, but if we're going to compare to delivery from Earth, we need to understand how those consumables are packaged, right? They have to fit into tanks or containers, which then go into packaging to go ahead and support launch and landing loads and environmental conditions. Our model takes that into consideration, and now we see about a 60% average increase in the total delivered mass. And if you take a look at the orange bars here, which is that total delivered mass of those consumables, we see oxygen is actually the most inefficient to be transferring from Earth to support these early habitation elements. So now I'm going to leverage some of the work of Sanders et al., Lin et al. This is dated back to about 2020, 2022, just as an example, an illustrative example of a couple of pilot ISRU concepts. There's a polar water mining concept and an oxygen from regolith concept based on carbothermal reduction. And I leverage these because there's a very detailed mass and power breakdown. That kind of data is important in trying to do these kind of trade space assessments at an architectural level. And a key takeaway here is that 1 ton per year oxygen scale that these pilot concepts were designed for, about 1,100 kilograms of water per year, is much more than is needed for these early habitation elements. Now, while we could go ahead and change our ISRU pilot scale to match habitation demand, I propose an alternate consideration of maybe we just consider reducing the duty cycles of pilot scale systems. And that gives us the margin and the flexibility to understand things like environmental context and deal with those unknown unknowns that are surely going to arise, so we have a much more robust architecture or system going forward. Alternatively, you could feed forward into reserve stockpiles if you manage to hit those kind of targets. Now, just purely anecdotally, take a look at those total bottom line masses for these concepts compared to that delivered mass for oxygen and hydrogen for one mission. And you'll notice that they're fairly similar, about 1,200 kilograms for that total delivered mass, and you're under that for these two pilot ISRU concepts. So for that break-even assessment, again, we're looking at open loop resupply from Earth, ISRU supplied, or regenerative life support. Regenerative life support is like what's baselined on the International Space Station, being able to recycle water and produce oxygen. Some of the masses and powers of ISS heritage systems are shown in the table here. And just for a comparison's sake, I took those previous ISRU pilot concepts, and we don't really need to liquefy oxygen or even store hydrogen if you're looking at purely a life support customer. So if I were to take off those masses and those powers, those are depicted in the tables. And then we take a look at this break-even assessment. That dashed white line projects that open loop life support or consumable resupply from Earth in terms of equivalent system mass. And what we see here is that within about 40 to 49 days, ISRU, the mass of those pilot scale systems, breaks even with open loop life support demand from Earth. If we lean into ISS technology, which intuitively we think we should be recycling the consumables that we would be using to sustain crews, it's actually less mass advantageous. It takes longer for it to break even than these pilot scale ISRU systems. If we apply the cost model, it suggests upwards of almost $800 million in terms of total cost. That's full DDT&E, design, development, test, and evaluation of all the packaging systems, the delivery systems, the operations and sustainment cost of those consumables. At about a 63-day mark, you could take that kind of dollar cost for open loop life support and apply it to ISRU investments, or even less potentially, or diverge it against multiple paths, and that provides an opportunity for kind of an economic proving ground. So ISRU may start showing some of these advantages in less than 2 crewed missions for Artemis. Back to that proving ground, remember, there's benefit in a supportive infrastructure, and we're seeing that unfold in Artemis with myriads of partners through Argonaut and Argonet, the Lunar Terrain Vehicle contract, Canadian Space Agency and the Lunar Utility Vehicle. There'll be other assets there to help carry some of those burdens of proving ISRU capabilities. Time is on the side of the ISRU developer. More than 90% of initial operations are going to be uncrewed. And there is even a possibility of having supplemental power. Just habitation system design itself suggests that there could be about 7 to 12 kilowatts of power available during uncrewed periods during daylight, just based on their basic design. So don't need to go it alone, right? So in the space resource utilization life cycle, we see that early habitation demand and ISRU demonstrations, or specifically pilot scale demonstrations, could help with that technology advancement and initial customer base. There is local demand, there's flexibility for that pilot scale production, and there's a supporting infrastructure. That can allow us to kind of grow in a sustainable manner. And as we prove out those ISRU capabilities, some of those mass savings could then be applied to things like regenerative life support systems, so we're good stewards of the resources that we extract. So with that, I thank you for your time, and happy to connect with you and talk a little bit more about life support.
Thank you. So, any quick questions for James? We have a hand right at the back this side. And another one here.
Hi, Paul from DLR. James, we already talked yesterday a little bit, so I have a more provocative question for you. Do you think NASA will allow their astronauts to drink water that comes from lunar ice, considering that it took decades for NASA to allow astronauts officially to eat plants grown on the International Space Station?
I do think you hint at culture changes. And again, I'm going to speak off of my personal opinion here, right? Culture is a hard thing to change, and there's definitely a bit of risk aversion when it comes to crews. But at the same point, we have to lean into the entire Artemis campaign focusing on going from the moon to Mars and to places where you have to learn to live off of the land. So I think that's going to seed some of that culture change. We've seen it on the ISS. There was a lot of debate before even leveraging the astronauts drinking from water reclamation systems on ISS, and now it's commonplace. So I do think the shift will occur. It may occur a little more slowly at first, though.
Thank you, Paul.
I have a question linked to food, actually. I was wondering how all this will perhaps one day in the very deep future enable edible food on the moon. And because as the song goes, my home is where my food is grown. So how to make a real home where food is grown for astronauts? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good piece that I didn't dive into in this analysis, right? I just focused on water and oxygen just for sustainment of crew and basic operations, but you need water for plant growth, right? You need nitrogen gas. The model does look at nitrogen gas, which we're not going to be able to, in the near term, be able to produce easily in the lunar environment, of course. The key takeaway here is if you start small, and if maybe the culture isn't receptive to using that water for crew consumption, maybe we can see a paradigm shift where we can use that water for crop production at a demonstration scale. There's multiple different use cases here, and then we don't have to rely on transporting that water to do a proof of demonstration for crop growth.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you.
I'm going to push on for time reasons. Thank you. So next we have Jerry Sanders from NASA and a talk entitled Restructuring Development and Implementation of ISRU in NASA's Artemis program.
It's wonderful to be here again today, third time, so you're probably getting tired of me. Thank you, Clive. Yesterday, from my first presentation, I talked about looking back at where we were from a technical perspective. Today's discussion is really looking at it from a programmatic perspective. When we started our conversion from the Evolvable Mars campaign in 2018 to what's become Artemis Lunar, we had to rethink things. At the same time, ISRU moved from the Human Exploration Program to our Space Technology Mission Directorate. And so we had to basically create a new pathway for ISRU, as well as a new way of doing business compared to how we did before. So one of the biggest things, going back to the first speaker, is the chicken and the egg. How do you develop ISRU systems without a market? That's something that has been part of the problem that existed for ISRU for a very long time. And I can point to, before getting into ISRU, I was in satellite servicing. And we had the same problem between tankers and customers. So here we show basically an evolution where we first started. We recognize there's two major resources on the moon. There's the water, potentially and permanently shadowed craters. There's the known oxygen and metals in regolith. Which ones do we focus on? Because of the high risk, high reward of water, we had this leader-follower approach. We're going to do as much as we can on understanding water and mining water. At the same time, we'll follow that with our more known oxygen and metal extraction. That evolved to now what kind of missions would we do? How many demonstrations would we feel comfortable on performing in either of those two before moving to what we called our pilot plant? And the idea of the pilot plant was, again, to break this chicken and the egg and to put the non-recurring costs mostly in the form of government capabilities versus leveraging those companies. And so the ISRU of a pilot plant was to pick something at a reasonable scale, do the end-to-end operations as for what I call a reasonable amount of time to work out the bugs, understand the environmental uncertainties that have been talked about this morning. The other part of it was, in the past, we would have a single ISRU project and it would be given a budget. We had to create a roadmap, and you worked on that on a yearly basis. Going to STMD, they started a new program where everything being funded within our technology program had to go through this scenario of understanding thrust, strategic outcomes, and then different capability areas, which provided a framework for understanding everything that we do and how it goes to higher level objectives. From that, we created our Envision Future Priorities. I've talked about that in previous years. We come up with technology gaps, which then led to having technology and investment portfolios and development roadmaps. And throughout this process, we tried to advertise as much information as we could, and I'm just showing some charts that I've presented in the past to basically let everybody outside of NASA know these are our priorities, these are our needs, and this is how we think it fits into the picture. Another thing that NASA did over the last 5-6 years has been, again, advertising and getting involvement in what does it mean to go to the moon and why we're going to the moon. That started with the Artemis architecture segments of here's, our first thing is just to get humans back to the moon, then foundational exploration, was mentioned sustained lunar evolution and going on to Mars. That then got broken down into what are the objectives with respect to transportation, life support systems, infrastructure. And then recently, if you haven't read it, the Artemis architecture definition document, Rev B, goes all the way down to what functions would we actually need to do to work these use cases and applications. Again, going to STMD, and I'll show you that we're going through a reimagination. So Space Technology Mission Directorate was all about technology leveraging and technology readiness levels. So you had multiple solicitations that were aimed at technology levels and different audiences, and so we had to stitch together basically how, where is this part of ISRU with respect to TRL levels and who could work on those technologies. And it was all aimed on the left-hand side of the chart at how do we advance U.S. capabilities and support, and encourage economic growth, and at the same time to inspire and develop these things. We are now thinking of transitioning. This is not, it's not been officially approved by Congress or NASA at the moment, but the idea is to go now again towards a more traditional approach where you have capability activities and all those solicitations are used now to support those very clear capabilities versus vice versa. And ISRU operates in what's called the live domain, and we work with surface power as well as surface construction activities because those are very synergistic with each other. You can't do ISRU without surface power. You need construction and excavation capabilities, and they're all intertwined. A big thing that has happened, and especially in my career over the last 5-6 years, has been community involvement. So how do we get, industry, academia, the public, putting their say in things? It started with the Moon to Mars objectives, putting those out for discussion and debate, and then within the last year, we put out what were called the shortfalls gap assessments, and everybody was open to putting their 2 cents into that. At the same time, we've developed consortiums, and consortiums have come about. The first one, League, that Clive and I go back, 2005 timeframe, and the first lunar roadmap, I think, came out of League. Recently, in the last 5 years, we've instituted the Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium, and then 2 major activities, Cosmic and Logic, are bringing communities involved into the ISAM, the servicing, the interfaces, and standards aspects. Just to touch briefly on that shortfalls and priorities, two messages that I got out of it.
One is there were 187 shortfalls. ISRU kind of fell in the middle range, so the things that are really needed to get humans back on the moon were the top 30, we started to get into some of those, okay, once we got humans on the moon, here are some of our issues, and there's the priorities with respect to ISRU. Besides prospecting, water, oxygen, and propellants obviously came forward. The other interesting thing was each community was allowed to rank their thoughts on these gaps. And what we saw was that, small industry, NASA centers, academia, all ranked ISRU within the top 10. Large industry, other government agencies, kind of moderate numbers. It was our internal folks in ESDMD and SMD that gave ISRU the lowest priorities. And to some extent, it makes sense because both of those programs are very focused on getting humans back to the moon and doing lunar science. But it does show a mismatch between what the external community wants and what NASA wants, per se. On my side, since I've been telling you we want to enable industry, getting those results basically confirmed that we are doing what we've been chartered to do. And then in the end, what we are trying to do now is, one of the other findings was, it really was too hard to really rank and stack 187 gaps. Most people only voted on the things that they were familiar with. By the time they got to the lower numbers, you're just going quickly through them. So we are going through now another process of reevaluating a smaller number of shortfalls, putting those out for comments, and once again, reprioritizing. And with that, I'll bring my conclusion presentation to an end.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jerry. Well, I wonder who has questions for you?
Nobody. It's all very perfectly clear.
It's Clive, and then we have a question over here. Oh.
That's it. Walk past Clive.
Thanks, Jerry. I was wondering if you'd been using AI to triage some of that list.
Me personally, no. I mean, I'm old school. I looked at the Excel spreadsheets and the numbers and just kind of graphically looked at it. It would be interesting to see, a more AI approach to the results that came out of it.
Yeah, I've forgotten my question now.
That's your age.
Yeah. It's the number of technology gaps. And within those gaps, launch landing pads don't seem to feature too prominently.
No, it was one of the lowest priority numbers, which amazed both Mark Hilberger and I.
And it amazed me too. And so the question comes back to how were the priorities made? And you alluded to this, that we went through, I don't know, an internal ranking. Can you explain that process?
Well, yeah, just very briefly. Where the issues, I think, came to bear was everybody was able to vote. However, the weight of that vote varied differently between the stakeholders. And so the weight of ESDMD and SMD were ranked the highest. I think large industry was next. And so here again, it's what are you worried about today versus what is your longer term issues that you want to see. And this goes back to, ISRU is different than almost everything else in the government in that is, we look at return on investment. We look at long scales, whereas a project manager today looks at what is my budget, what is my problem, how do I solve it? I don't care about 5 years from now. And I think that mentality needs to change.
Thank you.
And I think we're...
Well, you've been very good on time, Jerry.
Oh, well,
over the years that I've got to know you, you're getting better and better at timekeeping.
Third time's a charm, I guess.
No, it's been a few years now. But I will allow you one more because it's usually the other way around. Are there any other questions for Jerry? Well, no, not yet.
Okay.
Thank you. They know where to find you, that's for sure. Thank you very much to Jerry. And now another face that we all know so well at Space Resources Week is Carlos Espejel from S.a.r.l, and you're going to talk about optimizing the space resource value chain for reserves evaluation and cut-off grade estimation. Carlos.
Good morning, everyone. Let me just check this. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lisa, for the very kind introduction. So again, I'm Carlos Espejel. I am the founder and director of S.a.r.l. It is always a privilege to be part of the Space Resources Week, but this time is particularly special for me because this is the first time I will be representing my own initiative. So today, I will be sharing just a little bit about S.a.r.l, but mainly about a concrete topic, cut-off grade estimations. Now, cut-off grades are very important because this is how we estimate reserves and the value chain optimization. I apologize in advance, it might get a little bit technical, but this is very important in terms of our field of ISRU. Okay, S.a.r.l, who we are. So we're a consultancy and technology company. We're based in Luxembourg. We started last year in 2024, and we, of course, specialize in value chain optimizations and reserve evaluation. Now, on this, we are a dual sector company. We work for the terrestrial mining industry and the space resources industry. We do consultancy, of course, on value chain optimizations and reserve estimations, as well for the space part. But as well with our partners, we also offer the services of systems engineering and legal services. Now, for the technology part, we might have a chance to present next year. We're starting to work on observation satellites for the mining industry. Okay, we are happy to share that we have customers. And one of our customers is Glencore. And the other one that I would like to share is Antamina. Why is Antamina special? Antamina is a conglomerate of BHP, Glencore, Teck, and Mitsubishi. This is such a big mine and so capital intensive that the only way they could start the mine and operate the mine is as a consortium. So I think this is a model we're going to replicate for exploration and for operations on the moon. But this is enough about S.a.r.l. Let's move into the topic. All right, resources to reserves. How do we estimate a reserve on the moon? So some of you already maybe seen this graph, which is a classification system from LORS. But for the ones that have not seen it before, I will explain it very quick, as we're going to use this to go into cut-off grades. This is very simple. So if you're an exploration company and you need to report your exploration results, and you have resources with low geological certainty, then you're at the bottom. You're speculative resources. But through exploration, if you do more of that, then you can report measured resources all the way there. But let's have a look at a more concrete example. So on the left-hand side, your right-hand side, that's the south pole of the moon, and we're going to focus on that region of the famous PSRs and the famous craters, and that's data that most of you have seen. That's neutron spectrometer data from LRO, and according to LORS, that would be a province of hydrogen anomalies, and that would be speculative resources. But then someone in NASA is like, hey, hold on, we actually have data with higher geological confidence. Yes, you're right. One of those examples is L Cross, where we know it hit Cabello's crater, and therefore they confirmed H2O. So that would be prospective resources. But if we want to keep moving up the pyramid all the way to measure resources, we need to do more exploration, we need to do ground truth exploration. So let's focus on Cabello's, because we have more data. Once we have a closer look, we will identify few potential deposits. There we need to make a decision on it. And we might decide to land on deposit 1. So we send a lander, and then we send a rover, and we drill. So that would be a ground truth exploration. Now, if we hit the target and we confirm the presence of H2O, that's extremely important because we just went across the discovery test line, and now we can report a discovered resource. And this is crucial because this is where resource investors put the big money in, and they're like, here's millions. And this is also important because this is where the ILRPC wants to go to. But this is something more that Clive and Antonino will share with us a bit later. But let's come back to the resource investors. So if they bring money, what do we do with the money? Well, we keep exploring. We keep exploring the deposit, And what we might find out is that within that, only the water concentration is in that yellow region, in this example. And that would be your measured resources. What we will find out as well is that there's going to be a distribution of concentrations. In this example, in the center, there's a concentration of 5%, and then you have an outer halo of 1.5%, and then you have an outer halo of really low grade of 0.1%. So someone might say, Carlos, I just spent $1 billion, I send landers, I send rovers, surely I have reserves. No, not yet. We need to ask code of grades to that, all right? So someone is like, okay, Carlos, how much of that resource is a reserve? Is it all of it? Is it part of it? And how much, is there any potential ore, the word ore in there? Well, we need to take a step back and let's go to definitions. Everyone maybe knows this definition. A reserve is the economical, extractable part of a resource. Okay, but what is ore? Is the economic extractable material scheduled for processing. So if there's some economic material and it's scheduled to go to the process plant, that's ore. So let's look at the new definition, code of grade. There we go. So what is the definition? It is the boundary of material within the resource with mineral above a specific concentration scheduled for treatment. In other words, code of grade is the economic definition of ore. And in terms of economics, we need to include all the value chain. So in other words, a reserve is made of ore, an ore is defined by code of grades, and we need the value chain to define the code of grades. It's not too bad, right? Okay, let's go straight into code of grades. So we have a lunar operation there, and what are the ingredients to estimate my code of grades? So on that, it's very simple. We, of course, need the resource knowledge, or concentration distributions, or quantities. Then very important, on the value chain, we need economic conditions. We need the market, of course. And then we need our value chain operational and capital cost. We need our selling cost. And very important, we need the value chain constraints. This is very important. We need our extraction capacities or processing capacities, and we also need our famous yields or recoveries. Market constraints. So once we have all these ingredients, we actually put them into these equations, right? Of course, we're not going to go through these equations, but if you are interested in code of grades in this field, I invite you to read Kenneth Lane. He is the godfather of code of grades, and he is a Rio Tinto person. Okay, but let's go straight to an example. How do code of grades look like? So again, we have our ingredients of code of grades. We have a market. So in this example, they are willing to pay $500 per ton for water, okay? Then they give us a contract. We have a contract in the hand of 1.5 million tons of water at a specific rate for 20 years. Then in terms of processing, we have an operational cost. We have our yields, let's say of 75%. Let's just remember this number for now. And of course, we have our extraction operational cost. Okay, very simple example. Now I would like for you to see this line here. That is the potential concentrations within the deposit of really low grade of 0.1% water to 2.5% water. And let's see where the reserve is. All right, see, if we put these numbers into the equations before, we'll get these numbers, which is $1 per ton. All the red zone is what is not economic. All the green zone is where it's economic. What does that mean? That our code of grade in this example is of 1.9. So all the material above 1.9% of water, it's a reserve. And everything below is not a reserve. So it's like, Carlos, but it's 1%. Yeah, but it's not a reserve. I'm sorry. Okay, so what if S.a.r.l says, hey guys, we just created a new technology and our recovery, it actually increased to 95%. Great. Let's re-estimate the code of grade. And in this case, it's 1.5. The code of grade just went lower. This is good news because now our reserve just expanded. And this also means that we might be able to produce less, it's less capital, and we might need to extract less. Okay, but what if we have some bad news? All right, the processing yield is actually 55%. So we need to re-estimate the code of grade. And in this sense, it's bad news. The code of grade is quite big, so it's 2.5. So only the material above 2.5 is part of your reserve. And the 1.5 is not part of your reserve. Now, this is crucial because in real life, we're going to have constraints in processing, extraction, the market, so we need to optimize all the time. And in this case, we will need to process and extract more. Okay, so we need to optimize in operations, expansions, and new projects, greenfield. In SpaceRS, we are designing this ISRU optimization environment, and we invite you, technology developers, to contact us and to be able to use the tool, where you're going to be able to put your capacities, your yields, and see how you contribute to the space resources value chain. Okay, I'm over time now. Conclusions. A reserve is made of ore is defined by cut-off grades, and value chain defines your cut-off grades. And in SpaceRS, of course, we would like to collaborate with technology developers, with investors, and with the space mining companies. Now, we have some space mining companies here, like for helium-3. And I would like to finish by saying, what is your cut-off grade? Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you. And stay for questions. Carlos? No. I know you left with a question, but there might be some questions
Please.
for you. And congratulations on your new company.
Oh, thank you.
A lot of exciting things happening for you this year. Congratulations. So questions. Oh, right, Ben.
Yeah, that was good actually, Carlos, and congrats as well. Look, one of the things that's obviously on Earth that we have to deal with is the whole issue of fiscal regimes. You know, royalties, in particular ad valorem royalties, can impact your cutoff grade. What have you kind of thought about that? Have you given that any thought yet? I mean, we don't have a royalty regime in place, obviously, but you know, there could be conversations around that particular issue.
That's a really good point. Now, of course, royalties are referred to a state, and at the moment, no one owns land on the moon, therefore no one is giving permits. So who is the royalty going to? Right? So in that sense, you're absolutely right. We do not have anyone to give a royalty to. However, is where do you put this royalty, if there is a royalty at some point? Do you put it in the selling cost? Do you put it in which part of the equation do you put it? Yeah, exactly. But maybe it could be in the selling cost, because that's where it has one of the biggest impacts. Yeah.
Thanks
for
Ben.
the question.
He's the next speaker as well. Dana.
Thank you, Carlos. I think it's a great initiative. It is predicated on an assumption of data openness. I think that's a great ideal, but I'm skeptical about that happening without a lot of incentives. So I'm just wondering what incentives or how you're thinking about making that data more transparent among the many constituents.
You mean the data as the cutoff grade estimations?
On everything, the cutoff grade estimations, the estimates of concentrations, even just the mapping of the resources, or even what resources, all of the above, I guess.
That's a good point. So it's common practice that the mining companies usually report their cutoff grades, because if you have a lower cutoff grade, that means that you're very efficient in your system, and therefore it's inviting you to invest, right? So usually cutoff grades are shared. In terms of the data that you need to estimate your cutoff grade, is not always shared. For instance, in the mining industry, they have their market prices, their copper prices, gold prices, and that's usually confidential information, right? But in terms of recoveries, your yields, that's usually open information. So the question for us will be, are we going to be open to just share cutoff grades? I think it's going to have to be common practice, and that's why I wanted to show that today. But in terms of commodity prices, it depends on where we head. Yeah.
Any other questions for Carlos? No. But you did leave them with a question, so I think they're pondering it internally. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And next up, we have Ben McKeown. He is from the Australian Centre for Space Engineering Research, and congratulations on your PhD, which he got on Friday. So another round of applause for his PhD.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm just going to talk through some of the research that we've been undertaking over the last few years into commercializing space resources. And in particular, I'm going to touch on one topic, which is the development of what we've called the Space Resource Fund. Now, As we all know, commercial space resources faces huge challenges. One of those challenges is the whole issue of benefit sharing. Is that going to be monetary or non-monetary in nature? We actually did some research on this at UNSW. We did a fair bit of modeling of royalties on the impact of royalties on lunar SRU. And we came to the conclusion that there is a very limited tolerance to royalties at the project level. That analysis also demonstrated or indicated that benefits from royalties could be immaterial on a global basis, even using pretty optimistic assumptions. A second challenge is the whole question of funding. We've heard about this over the last day or so. And the big question is, where is this funding going to come from? I mean, the terrestrial mining industry struggles with funding at the junior space. If we struggle at that level, we have to say that SRU is going to struggle with funding. The public sector is constrained by government mandates. The private sector, in particular, the sort of capital that could be interested in SRU, so venture capital, private equity, is constrained by portfolio and timing limits. So we kind of, we looked at these challenges and we asked ourselves, is there a mechanism that could actually address these challenges? And actually we believe there is, and that's what I'll talk through over the next few slides. So what objectives could such a mechanism have? We came up with 5, they're on the table there. I've touched on the top 2, the benefit sharing, funding. The third objective is the question of facilitating intergenerational equity. And this is all about fostering an ongoing social license to operate. I mean, my background, my experience is mining. I've seen the issues that you get in the mining industry if you don't have that social license. We really want to try to avoid that in SRU. A fourth objective is minimizing the impact on project economics. Let's try and make this economically sustainable at the project level. The fifth objective is achieving what we term superior investment returns, which will be needed if we're going to generate material monetary benefits. So within these objectives, we propose a Space Resource Fund, which has a double bottom line. The first bottom line is to generate monetary benefits for global distribution. The second bottom line is to provide capital for an emerging SRU industry. So in essence, our proposal is that initial capital seeds the Space Resource Fund to invest in commercial SRU in order to generate value for global monetary benefit sharing over the long term. What could it look like? We reviewed the universe of fund types to see if any one fund actually kind of met the objectives we have. We came to the conclusion that there isn't one fund type that can do that. But we do think you can combine elements from a number of different fund types. That's shown in the diagram there. So, for example, elements from strategic investment funds, elements from sovereign wealth funds, in particular the Alaska Permanent Fund, which has a unique distribution mechanism, private equity venture capital, and the developmental finance institutional world. We have suggestions around structure and funding for the SRF. In terms of structure, we strongly suggest trying to avoid the supranational type of organizational structure that you have, for example, with the International Seabed Authority, and instead look at analog funds out there, for example, strategic investment funds. There are a lot out there set up by national governments to really target individual problems or focus areas. They're similar in structure in many cases to private equity and venture capital funds, so they're well known, they're easy to implement. And the diagram there is just an indication of our suggestion of a fund structure. In terms of initial funding, we would suggest targeting initial seed funding in the $2 billion range. And this is sized so that if performance targets are met, the material benefits generated over the long term should be significant. The monetary benefits should be material. But it's not so big that investment performance is compromised at the fund level. We propose global contributions on a pay-to-play type basis. So, all state parties that want to participate or want to benefit also contribute, perhaps on a some sort of subsidized basis by wealthier nations subsidizing less wealthy nations. I've mentioned investment performance on a couple of occasions. This slide talks to that. The diagram there is a graph of value created at different annualized investment returns over a 50-year time period, starting off with a base of $2 billion in capital. There are a couple of takeaways from that. Firstly, over a 50-year time period, investment performance really does matter. You can see that but from the two columns on the right-hand side. The difference in value created between a 10% and a 12% per annum investment return over 50 years, on our modeling, it equates to about $200 billion, more than $200 billion, actually. The second takeaway, at least on our modeling, is that income from royalties pales into insignificance versus investment performance. And you see that from the column on the left-hand side of the graph. The blue bar at the bottom is the royalty income. So this kind of points us to the direction, or in the direction of using an active investment strategy, as typically is used by private equity and venture capital, as opposed to a more passive investment strategy as typically is used by sovereign wealth funds. And actually, we would suggest being pretty aggressive in return targets and say, target at least 10% per year. A key part of our proposal is the whole question of benefit distributions. That diagram there is a very high-level suggestion around benefit distributions. The one point to highlight is that we're suggesting that distributions are made directly to global citizens instead of passing through national governments. This has been done by the Alaska Permanent Fund, and they've done that very well. So, if they can do it, why couldn't this sort of construct do it as well? Distribution strategy would be very important for maximizing value. There are two elements we propose here. Firstly, a fund size, a trigger for the start of distributions, and we propose either a fund size trigger, for example, $50 billion, or a timing trigger, for example, year 25. And we also propose a maximum annual distribution rate. We've undertaken some modeling around this, and that modeling does back this strategy up. Kind of indicates that delaying the start of distributions and limiting the annual distribution rate really leads to more value being generated over the long term. So to conclude, we actually do believe it's possible to design a fund mechanism that does have the potential to generate significant value for benefit sharing. We do think it could contribute to addressing funding challenges of SRU. An important point for me is that it would have, or we believe it would have, a limited impact at the SRU project level, and we do think it'd be relatively easy to implement. But, and there always is a but, it would need initial seed funding, and the question is, where does that come from? And value generation would be very dependent on investment performance, so there'd need to be a strong focus on investment strategy and on the team that actually executes that strategy. So thank you. I'm not sure we've got a huge amount of time for questions, but...
Thank you.
Thanks.
Are you trying to get out of questions? No.
Absolutely.
First hand is up.
There we go. What you have stated morally is great. However, you had a key statement early on which is not correct. And that is you basically said in one of your charts, financial sharing is a key tenet of the OST. And that is not correct. It is of the Moon Treaty, benefit sharing in the world. But the OST never says anything about financial benefits to the world.
Sorry, yeah, Jerry, sorry, I didn't actually mean that. If I had that in the graph, that's what you picked up.
Yeah, there was a table, and the first bullet basically talked about financial sharing and said key tenet of OST.
Ah, okay, no, fair enough.
And
yes,
so
yes,
there are
okay,
many
okay,
countries, of
okay.
which I'm one of,
Yes.
which are completely against financial sharing.
Yes, I stand totally corrected on that one, actually. Yep.
Thankfully, we have eagle eyes in the audience to
You
pick
do.
up any issues, and they're happy to share it with us all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Question here. Oh, yes, and then in the middle. Yes.
Congratulations. This is potentially seminal stuff. I think it's great to see. I was wondering if you'd factored sort of ecosystem benefits, having technologies emerge simultaneously, the way things could work when things are designed in tandem.
Look, you know, we're kind of limited to 10 minutes. I actually had a slide in this presentation for investment strategy, and in that, I suggest that actually the ecosystem that you target is not just the projects, the SRU project, but it's the whole ecosystem around it. So you're starting off with technology development, you're looking at logistics, you're looking at the whole, everything that could be related to SRU. You open that up as your investment universe. So personally, I totally agree with that. Yep.
I know that there's a question here in the middle, but Stephen is just behind. Stephen Freeland, I think.
Thank you, Ben. A wonderful presentation. Just two quick things. Firstly, at the global level, benefit sharing is a big mantra for, as you know, right? So I'm interested, you said benefits you envisage would be to citizens, you know, bypassing states. I'm interested in what the distribution strategy will be. The second thing, Jerry, if I could just take up what you said, actually the Moon Agreement does not talk about financial. It talks about equitable sharing of benefits. It's the Law of the Sea Treaty, and this is an important issue. The Law of the Sea Treaty, which talks about, you know, deep sea mining and all of that, talks about the equitable distribution or equitable sharing of financial and other benefits. Red rag to a bull, we all understand. Moon Agreement still talks about equitable sharing of benefits, no mention of financial. Benefits can mean many things. You're talking about financial benefits, which is wonderful. So investment strategy, are you going to differentiate between citizens of less developed countries, you know, as opposed to developing countries, or is it, you know, across the board, that sort of issue? I know you haven't got much time, but I'm really interested. Thank you.
Look, the way I see this is I mean, and for me, in the ideal world, every country that wanted to participate in this could participate in it. Now, how do you make that fair? And that's, you know, that's one of the questions that we were kind of going through. If you look at what the International Seabed Authority has done, they've actually done a huge amount of work on the allocation of royalties, if ever they get any royalties, from deep sea mining. And it's based on gross national income, it's based on population, it's based on a whole series of factors. Now, I haven't done the modeling on this, and someone would have to do it, but I don't see why you couldn't kind of invert that and say, right, you know, the wealthiest countries based on a similar sort of methodology pay in proportionally more than the less wealthy countries, if you see what I mean. So, but the less wealthy countries take more out. So you get some sort of, and someone would have to do the work around that benefit sharing type allocation and receiving. But for me, that's not a difficult thing to do, actually.
Thank you very much. And for anybody who missed Stephen's speech yesterday, it was in the legal section, the delegates room. Stephen Freeland is the chair of the working group on legal aspects of space resource activities for UNOSA, and a wealth of knowledge in all legal aspects of space and things around that. Question here.
Okay. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I find that a space resource fund is a great idea. But as an investor and fund manager, I would like to know what will be the underlying assets. I would like to know what is the investment strategy, and I would like to know as well what kind of targets are you aiming at? Are you going to invest in startups, scale-ups, growth companies, or just you know, I think this slide that you said you had would be very interesting to have a look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, look, as I say, I left a slide out which was about investment strategy. I mean, I come from the private equity world, and I come from a private equity world that invests in natural resources. So I've spent a lot of time investing in projects. Projects are great, and you can put in different financial instruments. You know, you can invest from equity, debt, whatever, and all that sort of stuff. My sense is that it's going to take quite a lot longer to get to the point where a number of those projects are investable. So if we're going to, and what is really needed in SRU, in commercial SRU, is building up the ecosystem so those projects can actually be developed and operate in a way that you know, that other investors can invest in. So our proposal basically is to invest in the whole ecosystem that has some connection to space resources. So, you know, if you've got a if you've got a launch company that is participating, for example, in sending equipment to the moon, why can't you invest in that? I mean, as a private equity fund investing in mining on Earth, we were able to invest in, our LPs, our investors said to us, you can invest in stuff that's associated with mining. So look, one would need to really think through the strategy, but for me to make a fund, to deliver on the bottom line, which is generating material monetary benefits, in my mind, you're really trying to make the investment universe as broad as possible, to give yourself, so that you don't get constrained and you don't get kind of forced down investing into investments that are suboptimal. Because if that happens, then you're not going to deliver your returns, basically. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, more or less.
We can have a chat afterwards if you want.
Lunchtime is in 15 minutes
Yeah.
after the next talk. Thank you very much indeed, Ben. And before lunch, we welcome to the stage Jim Hondros from Off-Earth Resources, Space Resources, and Thinking Like Miners.
Good afternoon. Those introductions are really full on. Thanks for the opportunity to speak again at this conference, this important conference, and thanks to the organisers. We've been coming for a number of years and continue to be impressed by everything we see, as I hope you are. I'm Jim Hondros. I'm a director of Off-Earth Resources, which is a very small Australian startup company. My fellow directors are also from the mining industry, but also from space insurance and small business startup. In my day job, what I get paid to do is to work in the mining industry. I have more than 40 years experience in operational, corporate and consulting roles in a wide range of commodities and different size projects. What we've been trying to do is work at the concept level. Basically, how do we get the miners involved in off-earth resources, and how do we get a mine into production? What I would like to do in this talk is to provide some thoughts on space resources from a mining and processing perspective. I was thinking as I was sitting there, I might be a little bit controversial, so please bear with me. I'd like to do this by providing a snapshot of the terrestrial mining industry and then provide some suggestions for avoiding the ISRU analysis paralysis by considering new paradigms, thinking about it differently. And then I'd like to point to some can-do opportunities. So what does the terrestrial mining and processing resource industry look like? Well, it's confronting. You can see that in Australia alone, there was $50 billion spent a financial year or two ago on just capital. There's $110 billion spent on international capital projects. Operating costs are above $500 billion a year. One of my favourite statistics is how much money is spent on exploration. So what is exploration? It's really the gambling money. It's the money that gets written off given that there may be a big win at the end of it. Only 1 in every 1,000 prospects ends up being an operating mine. However, almost all of them receive some funding along the way. Mining operations are long-term projects. It can take up to 10 years, if not 20 years, for an operation to come into full production before you see profit. That means for 10 or 20 years there is investment. It's interesting to note that mining companies don't do mining. A lot of the big mining houses, and we heard about BHP and others earlier, tend not to mine. What they do is they contract in specialist services. So they tend to be aggregators of specialist services. An important factor is that the economics drives the investment, not technology. So the miners won't start a mine based on technology. There might be the odd case, but generally it's around making money. Generally, demand drives supply. There needs to be something that people want. However, interestingly, if you look at some of the big mining provinces that have opened up around the world, and I think of the Pilbara with iron ore in Western Australia, that was someone taking a risk. That was someone putting a couple of drill holes down and going, wow, look what I've found, and almost defining a new economy. So this kind of highlights that the mining industry doesn't have one view of risk. Risk changes with time, risk changes with the situation. So where are all the opportunities we keep hearing about in space? And why haven't we seen any yet? Well, as a mining industry practitioner with more than a passing interest in space, there's an obvious and very wide chasm in the way that the mining industry and space industry think. And we call it the paradigm chasm. It's a gulf between the thinking. Let's consider some arbitrary practical observations, and please don't shoot me. Don't shoot me down. These are qualitative observations. These are just things that pop into my head. If we look at the space industry, it's really technology driven. It's focus on technology, it's focus on missions. Investment is generally via research and development grants or contracts. The risk appetite is relatively low. And there tends to be in-house development of technology which can be competing. You can have competition. If we look at the mining industry, and again, these are generalisations but observations as well. If we look at the mining industry, it's economically driven. There's a focus on the end point. Remember I said that it takes up to 20 years for a mine to get into production. There's a focus on the end game. We see private and institutional investment, and we see active management of risk. Risk management changes with the age of the project. Early on, the explorers will do anything to find something. Towards a mature mine will be very small risk, have a very small risk appetite. Long-term goals, again, reiterating that long-term investment. It's diverse. I love it when someone says to me, I'm talking to the mining industry. And you think, that's like, I've got a piece of string. You don't know how long it is, who you're talking to. It is very diverse. And I just want to reiterate that the smart miner is the one that integrates specialist services. I'm not saying that one is right and one is wrong, so please don't come and crucify me over lunch. But what I am saying is there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect in the thinking. All the bits are there, but there's a disconnect in the thinking. Although I'm deeply embedded in the terrestrial mining industry, it is a challenge even to get people to talk about it, let alone take it seriously. This reluctance flows through to investors, and again, someone would say to me, we're already talking to the investors into the mining industry, and I would say, yes, they're looking for your technology to see how they can reduce costs on Earth, rather than wanting to invest in off-Earth resources or resources off Earth. So the question is, how do we bridge the gap? And I think it's all about, or we think it's all about, alignment in approaches. It's about having a common goal. It's about having a couple of case studies. It's about having a couple of pilot projects. And it's about how we then use that to attract the bigger investors. But overall, I'm a simple guy. I think let's keep it simple. So what have we been doing at Off-Earth Resources? What we've been trying to do is to try to find the nexus. Try to find how we can bring all these bits together, at least to talk to start with, to get some common alignment. We think the opportunity lies in a simple collaborative missions. And we've tested this within our networks. As I said, we've got a space network and we've also got the mining network. But above all, we continue to be amazed that all the bits of missions exist. I was talking to my colleague at coffee break, and even within the small town of Adelaide in South Australia, there are enough separate little specialist services that we could do a simple mission. We could bring the bits together with a common goal. And the costs are not prohibitive. We've done some preliminary work which says for 25 million bucks, you can actually do something. For 75 million bucks, you can do a lot more. I don't want to go into the details or the basis of this at this stage, but the costs are not prohibitive to put together something that brings together the mining industry and the space industry. So let me bring this to conclusion. Just a few key messages. In situ space resources, space mining, space processing requires a resource thinking, I think, before it can become sustainable. And let's start with some simple collaboration missions and demonstrate that the space industries or the space resource industry is real. But let me finish with one slide, the most important slide. After 40 years in the industry, you soon learn that nothing is impossible and impossible is nothing. It can be simple. And it's all about round pegs in round holes. What does that mean? Get the right people at the right time for the right project and paradigm shatter. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Any quick questions for Jim before lunchtime? Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned lunch.
Yeah, that's a good one.
We have a question here.
Hi, Antonino, Lunar Policy Platform and ILRPC. No question, I just want to congratulate you for this talk. I think that's exactly what we need in this moment. Aligning the terrestrial mining community and the space resources community is key. As you said, the beats are there, but we need to do better at that. So I really appreciate your talk. I think we should have a conversation, and I would invite you this afternoon. We're going to have a presentation on the International Lunar Resource Prospecting Campaign that aims exactly to do this type of alignment, and I think there is a lot that we can do together. So, sorry, I have no question, but just thanks and congratulations.
We always like comments like this.
Yeah, I do.
Any other comments or questions? Oh, perhaps Jerry.
So I completely agree that the space resources and the terrestrial mining are completely different in terms of the economic focus and the technology focus. And I would give my opinion on the fact or comment that the reason why is we don't know how to extract the resources on the moon yet, whereas as well as we don't have a market. So we have been struggling with both how to do the job as well as how to create the markets where both of those currently exist on Earth. But I will say, we, as Antonino mentioned, we are reaching out to the terrestrial mining industry to understand those processes and where those synergisms are. So I fully applaud and support that activity.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was also a comment.
Yep, that's good. They're the best questions.
Any questions?
No.
Oh, yes, over here.
Thanks, Jim. I'm just curious, have you given this presentation to the Australian Space Agency? And if you did, how was it received?
I'll just answer your first question. Yes, we've tried. That's all.
I understand. The lack of comments beyond that sentence says everything. Anything?
I'll get into trouble for that. You watch. Yeah, I know.
Whatever is said in this room stays in the room. We're online as well, but apart.
Oh, you didn't tell me about that.
Well, oh yeah, Clive.
Clive Neal, University of Notre Dame, but you talked about breaking the paradigm and you hinted at it. How are we going to break the paradigm? And you said, we'll get people together and do something cooperatively, and then it got a bit vague. I need to refocus you.
We only had 10 minutes, didn't have an hour.
Okay, well,
you can buy me a beer.
In 30 seconds.
Buy me a beer later and we can go into a bit deeper.
Oh, is it a 1 beer or a 5 beer?
Or a bottle of wine.
Is it a 1 bottle or 2 bottles?
Okay, fine. Drinks
Alcohol
are tonight at Melusina, but we have an afternoon to get through first. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. So for those who came into the room late, a couple of things have been lost: a credit card and a phone. If they belong to you, they will be at reception. So a 1-hour lunch, and we'll start in here with 2 parallel sessions here and in the delegates room downstairs as well. And bon appetit.